Hi, everybody. How you feeling? Feeling good? It's Thursday. We're almost there. You're like, I'm there. I'm here. I want to thank you all for coming this evening for Blackouts and Other Visual Escapes by Dr.Sampada Aranke, who is sitting right there and will soon join us. Sam is this is like...
It's cutting in and out.
Do we need it? No. You can project. I can project. You're very tiny. Can you project? Yes. Sam is coming to us from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and her visit is part of this project that I run called the Black Embodiments Studio, which is an arts writing incubator for graduate students that explores how definitions of blackness are produced and expressed in contemporary art. Residents of the Black Embodiments Studio read and discuss arts criticism while surrounding Black embodiments, while also visiting galleries and exhibitions here in the city that are putting on works by Black artists or that concern Blackness more broadly. So this quarter's graduate students have been looking at shows like Indira Allegra's show, which just closed at the Alice Gallery, Tavares Strawn, who has an exhibition up at the Fry right now, but also Sandra Perry's new work that is at the Seattle Art Museum right now. Well, two of those three you should definitely go and see. So Sam is here today because her work models the kind of critical, scholarly rigor that academics can bring to the realm of aesthetics and the question of aesthetics, while showcasing how the aesthetic necessarily demands and asks more of the kinds of language that we're steeped in the academy. So what does it mean to look at the visual or the sonic and try to describe it within our sort of rigid conventions of academic language? It necessarily has to become more fluid and more all-encompassing, I think. So the Black Embodiment Studio's project of training graduate students to practice these expansive modes of thinking and writing is generously supported by the Simpson Center for the Humanities and by the Jacob Lawrence Gallery, which is this year came under the direction of Emily Zimmerman. If you've not met Emily or been over to the Jake, you should go. What she's doing at that gallery is really, really excellent. I'm not going to give a super long intro to Sam because nobody likes long intros, and you can Google her CV. But I'll just give like some highlights. She's been invited to give many talks like the one that she'll be giving this evening, including most recently at London's Tate Modern in conjunction with the exhibition Soul of a Nation. Her publications blur the lines between academic and art audiences and include exhibition catalog essays on David Hammons, Patrick Martinez, Faith Ringgold, Kambui Olujimi, Sadie Barnett, and many more. She recently co-edited a special issue of Women in Performance dedicated to the 20th anniversary of Saidiya Hartman's, sort of genre, I don't even know, like world-creating book, Scenes of Subjection, Terror, Slavery, and Self-Making in 19th Century America. Sam is also a curator, and in 2017, she curated the show Dimensions of Black at the UC Davis Art Museum and the show Unstable Objects at the Alice Gallery, which I co-curated, but it was really, Sam just brought me along, did all of the heavy lifting. In March, the show she curated at the Hedron Gallery here in Seattle, which is the gallery of the Seattle University, will open, which is called Collapse, Recent Works by Dewey Crumpler. If you know the dates yet of the opening party? March 14th, she thinks. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Before we welcome Sam to the stage, just a quick note, there will be a reception after this upstairs in the Simpson Center, which is 202. So, find me if you don't know where that is. So I guess, with that, please help me welcome Sam to the stage. It's gross when you squeeze it like that. I want you to look.
Thank you, Kemi. Kemi's so humble. She's such a brilliant star, and I'm so happy to call her a friend and colleague and interlocutor. And thank you for the generous invitation, and also to Black Embodiment Studio. It's a real cutting-edge program, and I really hope that other universities kind of model some of their inquiries around it. I also want to thank Erin, who I don't think Erin's in the room, but for all her logistical magic in bringing me here, and the Simpson Center for the sponsorship. And to all of you, it looks like I have a really friendly group, which is great. Every time I'm in Seattle, I get charmed by this place, and I'm like, I want to stay here forever, but don't tell any of my friends in Chicago that. So parts of the talk that I'll be presenting today will appear in a catalog essay for the Contemporary Art Museum Houston's Walls Turned Sideways exhibition, which opens this summer. So this is a great, I'm really humbled to be able to present some of this work. It is a work in progress, and I'm going to be moving through about 7 works in 35-ish minutes. So I look forward to our conversation. Maybe we can direct if you want more of an expanse on some of the objects presented. Okay, enough of the preamble. Here we go. So the first section of this talk focuses on works that deform traditional modes of representation, which rely on sight as the primary sense of meaning-making. The artists depicted here obscure visibility as a way to call attention to how looking itself is dependent upon surveillance and policing as dual processes of the criminalization of Black life. I've been thinking about how contemporary Black artists deal with these questions for a little while now. It all started when I was lucky enough to do a studio visit with Sadie Barnette, an interdisciplinary artist working on her father, Rodney's FBI COINTELPRO file. Rodney was a prominent figure who helped found the Compton chapter of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Sadie, along with her parents, filed a Freedom of Information Act request and successfully received hundreds of redacted pages of her father's file. The original file is itself heavily redacted, evidence of the state's withholding, as the information left unseeable is most often the information most wanted. Details of operations, names of informants or agents, and goals and targets of key events. The desire to know is impeded by these stubborn obstructions, which protect the state from relinquishing details that would further support claims by victims of COINTELPRO of governmental overreach, violation of constitutional rights, and the encouragement, if not incitement, of violence against Black radical activists. In her project, My Father's FBI File, Project 1, Barnett applies spray paint to select pages from the file. Her pinks, purples, and blacks obscure already redacted portions of text and page into further illegibility, rendering opaque already impenetrable memos, descriptions, and data. She coats aerosol paint on decisively, allowing splatters of color to delicately sit on the page before laying it on so thick that the paint's viscosity bubbles from the surface. Barnett's riffs on the redactions of her father's file throw into even more crisis the conditions of visibility documented by the state's information gathering protocols and subsequent practices of redaction. Barnett moves us to the relevance of these documents now. If COINTELPRO pioneered state intelligence gathering programs to date, then Barnett's material methods take on ever contemporary meanings. The conditions of visibility here are where history's present becomes activated. The relevance of COINTELPRO's legacy is functionally accented by an aesthetics generationally out of its reach. Sadie Barnett speaks here to the public function of seeing itself. That radical visibility after COINTELPRO is always wrapped up in the nexus of policing, surveillance, criminalization, and vulnerability to state violence. Rodney Barnett's redacted FBI file make that reality certain, and Sadie Barnett's enhanced obfuscation make that reality felt. Barnett's work can be considered in concert with the long-standing practice of obfuscation as a method of both questioning and avoiding the demand for visibility. Taking as a center point a moment of Black resistance, the late Jack Whitton was particularly struck by the kinds of ways Black people had been framed socially and politically in light of such resistive acts. Whitton's 1964 Birmingham, an assemblage painting composed of aluminum foil, newsprint, stocking, and oil on plywood. Whitton applied black oil paint directly onto the plywood, allowing for the rough texture of the wood to appear in the work directly. Whitton peeled back and adhered aluminum foil to reveal a newsprint image of civil rights protesters in the center navel. This newsprint is overlaid with stocking, which gives the image a skine and a skin, at once mediating the image and troubling what Frantz Fanon called its racial epidermal schema. The textured relationship between flexible, soft stocking material and the hard, rough plywood backing inverts a more traditional relationship between figure and ground. Using wood as the painting structure, Whitton brings the outside in by choosing a material traditionally associated with the architecture of painting as the object upon which the canvas is stretched, or the frame within which the final painting is bounded. By slathering this plywood with black paint, we can think of how Whitton offers a commentary on how the color signals a broader racial politic. Black is, after all, a color that designates a particular relationship to power. By using it as the ground upon which the image lays, Whitton interweaves the social and formal qualities of the color, making the center image's visibility dependent upon the blackness from which it emerges. In this way, he troubles the question of visibility itself, as black is a color impossible to see through. The center skin and image come into partial visibility through the blackness that surrounds both. By taking on the grounds upon which blackness is materially made and made political material, Whitton demonstrates the textures and limitations of visibility itself, making a case for a consideration of the social and formal qualities of black as at once always present. This same emphasis on obscuring visibility is cited in Titus Kafar's Jerome series from 2014. In 2011, Kafar began searching for his father's prison records. During this process, he encountered a website that included photographs of recently arrested men, an overwhelming amount of whom shared his father's name, Jerome. Using these photographs as source material, Kafar painted individual portraits out of a multitude of Jeromes. The portraits, painted on gold-leafed wood panels, think back to Whitton here, were then dipped in tar, often leaving partially visible the original portrait, and in some cases covering the portrait entirely. So you can see examples of each here. Often installed as multiples in a row, these works convey the relationship between the individual and mass, as in the mass in mass incarceration, the singular and the multitude. These portraits directly take on the prison industrial complex and its historical antecedents of racial violence and punishment. By choosing to obscure each face with the thick sludge of tar, Kafar cites how the material itself was oft used in lynchings and adopted as a racial slur by whites in the 19th and 20th centuries. As many scholars have noted, these legacies of racial violence, physical and psychological in character, were absorbed in the 1970s in the expansion of the prison system as a newly systematized organization that continued what Sadie Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery. By obscuring the faces of each individual Jerome, Kafar mobilizes the ways that the prison industrial complex requires the invisibility of the persons who live behind prison walls. The viewer is asked to extract out the metaphoric and material meaning presented in these works into the world more broadly. The forced invisibility of those incarcerated is in direct correlation to the forced surveillance and policing, or hypervisibility, of Black people outside prison walls. Visibility, Kafar seems to say, is a structuring force of everyday Black life. So then to make visibility the subject at hand is to ask a broader question about its efficacy within the aesthetic terrain. Is it enough to call into question the conditions of sight that polarize Blackness into invisibility or hypervisibility? What other embodied modes can the aesthetic provide that might move us into a more entangled and perhaps activated relationship to sight itself? Barnett, Whitton, and Kafar are all working to obscure visibility within the realm of the representational. While all three artists work within slightly different representational realms, Barnett's text-based source materials, Whitton's newspaper photo, and Kafar's modernist portraiture, they share a common visual language in their use of obfuscation as a means to trouble the panoptic qualities of sight as weaponized against Black peoples. What might it feel like to make an escape attempt out of the panoptic and into the relational? In this next section, I move towards uses of abstraction as a method for activating the relational qualities that Blackness makes possible. Here, the color Black and its broader affective, sensorial, and embodied qualities, shorthanded by the term Blackness, open up modes of looking only made possible through the activation of the body itself. In Melvin Edwards' 1966 Cotton Hang-Up, we're given another approach to questions of racial violence and the criminalization of Black life. Hung up against stark white walls, the contours of sharp steel edges converge to form a kind of body in itself. Edwards composes a floating body with welded steel, whose weight works with gravity in its suspension overhead. Installed above gallery visitors, Cotton Hang-Up calls attention to the intensity of bodily proximity and height spectacularized by lynching. Cotton Hang-Up recomposes fragments to make a distorted and floating bodily whole, installed at approximate distance, just close enough to approach, yet far from saving. In this approach, Edwards utilizes sculpture, a medium already defined by its spatial relationship, to create a relationship between the welded steel body and the bodies who view it. Edwards literally asks the viewer to tilt her head up to look up to the work. This attention to the bend of the neck is twofold. Seeing that practices of lynching were often public events that took place in public squares and parks, their spectatorial nature as events are evidenced here by Edwards. Victims and survivors of the lynching act were often hung by their necks from trees, scaffolds, or other structures that provided height. On the one hand, Edwards hangs this abstract body in such a way that there's an angular gesture that mimics the bent neck of victims of the lynching act. So I'm thinking if we're looking at this tilt that's kind of coming down at a 45-degree angle, right? There's a kind of bend there that he's purposely putting into place that looks as if it's citing a kind of bent neck. But Edwards is careful not to simply represent this event in a straightforward way. He rather uses abstraction to make a case for the spectatorial nature of such acts by requiring the viewer to raise her head to take in the sculpture. This tilt of the head recalls the bend of the neck necessitated by spectators to look at the body hanging before them. Now, this is not to say that Edwards equalizes the terrors of racial violence in acts of lynching with those of viewing sculpture. Rather, Edwards charges the activity of looking by placing it squarely in the body. In doing so, Edwards offers a bridge between the body presented on abstract terms and the body that views. Within this dynamic activation, Edwards requires the viewer to attend to her bodily tension, to account for her positionality, and to reflect upon the intimacy necessitated by acts of looking. Fast forward 40 years later to Cameron Rowland's Attica series desk from 2016. This work is a black powder-coated steel desk with a laminate top. It's not just any desk, but a corner desk with two jointed surfaces that overlap, one side propped slightly above the other. This desk is manufactured by Corecraft, the New York State Department of Correctional Industries, a division within the state's Department of Corrections and Community Supervision. Attica Series desk is, indeed, made on site by prisoners at Attica Prison, who endure hours at work with little to no remuneration, but instead, as a demonstration of their, quote, willingness to rehabilitate, to demonstrate skill development, work ethic, respect, and responsibility, end quote, with the hopes of recognition, pardon, and freedom. That's Corecraft's website. In his 2016 essay that framed the exhibition that featured Attica Series desk, Rowland seamlessly draws a clear line between the legal, social, and contextual afterlives of slavery that necessitated bureaucratic histories and contexts of the prison industrial complex. This attention to context quickly adheres to our contemporary, where Rowland highlights Corecraft, who, by law, quote, can only sell to government agencies, including other states, at the state and local levels, schools and universities, take a look around us, courts and police departments, and certain nonprofit organizations, end quote. Thus moving us into an undeniable circuit of feedback loops between institutions and their varying anti-Black histories. It is Rowland's attention to context, however, I believe, that sets this work apart. The desk, a quotidian object of workplace necessity, where the mundane and endless activation of the contractual, the digital, the interpersonal is staged, becomes a site of bodily continuity, scale, and proximity. The desk forces a relation between viewer and object that confronts us with the reality that prisoners labored to make this everyday object. Art historian Huey Copeland has brilliantly accounted for how Black artists in the 1990s deployed installation as a method of activating the histories and legacies of slavery by spatializing its effects and making the object's poetic presence the subject of analysis. This object's poetic presence is bodily as much as it is spatial and relational. Rowland's decontextualization and recontextualization of the object outside of the prison, outside of the office space, and into the gallery does not place the image of prisoners or their labor at center. So it's installed just as is, right? There's nothing about the image that actually signposts, or, there's no photographs of prisoners making the work, right? There's no kind of romance or exploitation of that image. He shows the object as is. Instead, the viewer is asked to align her body around the object, thus taking into question taking in the question of labor itself at the level of bodily proximity. The viewer is invited to roam around the desk, imagining the kinds of labor enacted to build it, as well as the kinds of work that happens for those that sit at it. This embodied viewing opens up a series of relational questions about the relationship between labor and exploitation, context and content, incarceration and freedom. Even more poignantly, Attica Series desk makes the case for the ways that policing and prison provide the spatial coordinates for the viewer's relative freedom. If Edwards literally suspends the object so that the viewer must look up to take it in, and Roland locates the ways that prison labor provide the spatial coordinates of the viewer's freedom, Base Collectives from the Root Billboard series mobilizes modes of looking that make movement their material. For this work, Base Collective, an ongoing collaboration between artists William Cordova and Leslie Hewitt, take over advertising billboards and list names of radical activists, artists, and cultural thinkers who have been criminalized, incarcerated, or in some cases, killed. The series name itself is taken from the definition of the word radical, and while these figures are not always Black, Base's billboards have overwhelmingly featured the names of Black radicals. In the image you see before you, the names Fred Hampton, Mark Clark appear with no punctuation between them along the same horizontal plane. The white graphic text pops out of its Black background. Fred Hampton and Mark Clark were two prominent members of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in Chicago. Hampton, the famed and well-respected 21-year-old chairman of the Chicago chapter, and Clark, a 22-year-old member of the party, were gunned down on December 4th, 1969, in Hampton's home by the FBI and Chicago Police Department. The police raided the apartment in the middle of the night, where several members of the party were staying, including Hampton's 8-month pregnant girlfriend. Court filings estimate that between 82 and 99 shots were fired within the apartment. Base Collective provides none of this detail in their billboard. Instead, we are given a minimal text piece placed within an everyday commercial context alongside a neighborhood road. What is being sold in this context, however, is in question. While clear that Base Collective take on the protocols and procedures of commercial consumption, I would add that this work also opens up a series of responses to the question of visual consumption. If, as is implied, we encounter this billboard in transit from one place to another, there is a delay as the names would likely register in passing. What does it mean to consume the letters and compositional elements that spell out Fred Hampton, Mark Clark while in movement? What does our present tense movement tell us about this encounter with names from the past, names from past historical movements? Perhaps it is in this passing, this movement from one place to another, that the viewer is able to consume a genealogy otherwise forgotten in the traffic of everyday life. So I have to do a little light magic here, bear with me. Okay. I want to end with the consideration of Carrie James Marshall's black painting, an acrylic on fiberglass painting that extends 6 by 9 feet. So I'll just give you a second to take it in before I get those lights up. Like Whitton's composition, Blackness swallows the work. This is a considered and meticulous combination of multiple hues of the color black, some more purple, others more gray, and still others tinged with a pinkness in their outer glow. Pictured within this compositional feat is a scene right before a violent murder. Marshall pictures a room with a figure reading in bed. In this room, we can barely make out contextual clues. A banner that reads "Power to the People" with the Black Panther featured front and center, a copy of Angela Y. Davis's "If They Come in the Morning," a jewelry stand that is itself a clenched fist. These clues gesture us towards what is pictured, but the painting itself is hard to decipher in its entirety. In this work, Marshall depicts the bedroom of aforementioned Chicago Black Panther Fred Hampton. The viewer's perspective is from the back door of the apartment, which is the same door from which the FBI and Chicago Police Department would eventually raid and kill Hampton in his bed. But we are given none of this historical event. Instead, we're given the calm and comforting scene of a domestic space. We're given the intimacy of a familiar nighttime routine, the stuff of an everyday and familiar experience. What strikes me about Marshall's rendering, however, is how difficult he makes it to see the work in its wholeness, let alone picture it. This is, I believe, Marshall's ultimate embrace of opacity, where the layered and depths of black protect the subject pictured from our vision. This sense of protection and care is further illuminated by how Marshall makes his viewer work to see the work in partial and perspectival fragments. Relying on sight alone frustrates the viewer because the image is impossible to take in. In order to catch glimpses, the viewer must pace from one edge of the painting to the other, squat and angle her head up, peer by getting as close to and then as far away as possible from the painting. In other words, she must move her own body, be aware of her own scale and proximity to the work, take stock of her own perspectival possibilities and limitations. Here, I believe, Marshall makes a case for the embodied qualities of the look and opens up the relational capacities of blackness. Here, blackness is pictured, seen, felt as relational and active. It is about an aesthetic position that opens up a set of questions between figure and ground, subject and object, pictured and seen. In this work, as in the others I presented today, in order to get to these questions, the viewer must take a position in relation to both the work and herself, to activate a mode of looking that is deeply embodied, and reflect upon the relations made possible if we think of blackness as a general field of sensibility that moves through and against sight itself. Thank you. I think we have time for questions.
Yes, we do have time for questions.
There are no dumb questions. Or comments or feedback. Should I turn up the lights?
I have a question when we get started, and it has to do with that last point you just made. Could you talk a little bit about what you mean when you say blackness as a field?
Mm-hmm.
I think you said field or sensibility,
Mm-hmm.
which is sort of related to a related question is how do you use blackness as a category,
Mm-hmm.
As a way to sort of stage a conversation?
Yeah.
So yes, we know blackness as it's attached to bodies and sort of projected to different cultural meanings, but you're also entering into it as a way to like see.
Yeah. Just a softball question.
Just a little easy question to get the conversation.
One of the ways that I'll begin to answer the question is often when I teach my classes, which are on post-1960s Black American work, mostly conceptual. I always do a little like, what's it called? Like a set of agreements, right? With all of my students in the room, many of whom are Black, many of whom are not Black. And I say this thing that actually Fred Moten said in a seminar I was in once that was really important, right? Where he said this thing that like, we're all here because of the Middle Passage, right? So that like already is not about like a relationship to blackness as this like essential thing, right? That's like wedded within a certain categorization, but is about a kind of shared historicity, about a relationship, right? And And so then what I hope to do and what I strive for in my own work is then to think of that shared relationship as maybe a sensibility that we might be familiar with, but we don't know how to tap into as a looking practice, right, that brings us together. So, and I know that's tricky and slippery, and I don't really know how to. I think part of the way that I strive for specificity is to look at very specific works and think about their material and what histories they're drawing on, so as to not do this like really messy universalist thing, right? But I do think like if we can awkwardly try to develop a set of descriptions, to borrow a phrase from Saidiya Hartman's Venus in Two Acts, right? If we can strive towards a set of descriptions that somehow will detach us from blackness as this like essential thing that rests in the body, while still recognizing the particular violences that are leveled against people who are optically seen to have that racial tone, right? If we can try to do both at once, then maybe we can actually start having a conversation about like the pleasures and the affects and like the joys and the freedoms as much as like the pains and the murders and the killings. That doesn't really answer your question, but like some of it for me is about a provocation, right? Like how can we open up a provocation where blackness is an aesthetic field, a set of feelings that we may have but not know how to describe, because it does touch us all or something like that. Was that vague? Vague? I'm trying to get my Midwestern accent. Vague. Oh, yeah. Rachel. Oh, there's a question in the back, and then I'll come to Rachel. Yeah. Did you ever hear that? You did not?
I did.
Oh, great.
But
yeah.
Anyone else who
please.
Just jump the queue. Please feel free. I guess it's not really a formed question. It's a comment.
Yeah.
Sort of jumping off of your response, which I think is really helpful, and also the last comments that you had in this presentation. It seems like when one has to move in order to negotiate the opacity of blackness, it sort of presumes something about movement and the visualization of that. So, one of the ways in which blackness has been constituted as a social category is through the restriction of mobility. And the fact that we have to move in order to look seems to suggest something about the embodied subject who's looking. And so I just wonder if there's some way in which your meditation on the visual encompasses some aspect of the performative. It seems as if the way in which we think of our relationship to blackness is, on the one hand, scopic, and on the other hand, performative. So I just wonder how you're thinking of those two categories.
Yeah.
The visual and the performative together.
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's so funny having a PhD in performance studies and never thinking about the performative. Like on the front, because I know that I think I'm doing it a lot, but I don't call it that. So it's actually really helpful to hear that relationship mapped out in your question, because it's making me think a lot about how what I'm struggling with right now in this iteration is how to talk about viewership without, like, by keeping it expansive enough to recognize that the viewer, like, that's actually a particular experience as much as it's kind of opening up a general sensibility. So that, like, I really do think that, like, if you want to be patient with Marshall's black painting, you do kind of have to, like, pivot, right? Like, it's a general sensibility, but people are going to enact that sensibility in a different kind of register, depending precisely on their relationship to the subject presented or the object in front of them. So when, thinking about the performative elements of it, I think that what I'm struggling with is how to think about performativity when it comes to objects. And specifically objects that are still wedded to a kind of stillness, right? Even while they're inviting a kind of movement. So this is like, that question's really helpful. I wish I could answer it with more certainty, but I am really struggling with it. I don't know where, like, how to make it work, right? Because I also want to let the objects also have a certain kind of performative relationship, so that it's this kind of oscillation, but I'm having a hard time with it. That's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was kind of, I was thinking about that too, because I was thinking about Oakley's piece in Bromscopic and how she uses light and her body with visibility and invisibility. When you enter in the space, that she's hidden and has her back towards you, and then there's a moment in the performance where the light comes up, and then she's directing her gaze at you. But it's funny that you just said that, because then it makes me think that in the performative experience, in that the audience is stationary as an object, watching a moving body, and that in this scenario, the object is the one that's stationary and the audience is the one that is the moving body. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more. I really liked this analogy of this invisibility, thinking about visibility and invisibility in relationship to the prison complex, and then the highly visible killings and other, and that relationship to abstraction, or relational, and representation.
Yeah.
These things are neat.
I'm doing too much. That just, when you said it back to me, I was like, am I really doing all of that? But you're right. Yeah.
I mean, I think that is something I think about it more in terms of through the language of evidence, how the photographic evidence or the video evidence gets used in a courtroom, and what that translates into the realm of aesthetics.
Yeah.
And then how we kind of, that legibility of the image, and how it gets read as a kind of art object as well as a kind of evidentiary object, whether that legibility is clear.
Yes.
Or in the public domain, because I feel like that's another domain.
Yeah. Interesting. I think Cameron Rowland's piece is the most helpful. That's the place where I went immediately with the question, and it's making me think of this conversation that Chandan and Kemi and I were in yesterday that kind of turned to abstraction. And I think, I turned to someone like Cameron Rowland because his work often, like the critique that's leveled against it is that you have to get in the weeds with it to really understand it. Right, like if anybody saw his piece at the Whitney, it was like at the biennial, it was like a bunch of contracts, and you really had to like sit and read the contracts, and it was like tedious, and he like forces you to have this encounter with legal discourses and contractual discourses, and it's very tedious, right? And so kind of going back to this piece, what I find particularly interesting about these objects is they are working on these multiple levels. On the one hand, he's really leveling a critique against the contemporary art world and its fetishization of the ready-made, right? And its kind of fetishization of doing social justice, right? And like what the social justice mandate is. And I love that he kind of takes a dig, right, by showing something like this with those desires. On the other hand, he lets the object do all the work, and in the sense that like the entire institutional critique that he's leveraging in an art context can also at the same time be leveraged in the context of the prison industrial complex in one instance, right? And about the collusion between those two, that's a word to use right now, right? The collusion between those two kinds of institutions, and how, they are seemingly so far apart from each other, right? So the use of abstraction, the reason why I line this with something like abstraction versus a ready-made or institutional critique or these other genres is because it requires a kind of imaginary substitution of the representational form. So, yes, a desk is a desk, but then how is a desk used? Who uses as a desk, right? You kind of can fold into that. And then once you realize that it's a desk that is made in a prison, a whole other series of questions comes into being that allows the viewer, performatively perhaps, to fill in those gaps of like the racial stereotypes, the gender stereotypes, the class stereotypes of who's making that desk, right? And why they're making the desk. So in some ways, to me, it really encapsulates this tension, or not tension, actually the kind of openness, the possibility that exists when you just let the object do the work, right? And in the writing, he talks about all sorts of things, right? Like he talks about court craft, and he talks about, so if you want to show this piece, you rent it at the cost of its making, right? So you rent it at the cost of its making for the duration of how long it took to make, right? So even inside the contractual language, there is this kind of, you're literally participating in the complicitness of expanding the prison industrial complex, right? So even in all of the details, there's a certain kind of inner working, but you could leave all that behind and just see adding a series desk and see the work and maybe the little one sentence that's in the exhibition packet you get, and it'll do it for you. That was a rambling answer, but I am interested in how abstraction gets us there, which is, and I'm using that word like improperly because I'm a bad art historian, but I prefer it in this case than conceptualism or something. Yeah. Thanks for the question. Yes.
I want to go back to the beginning. Is it Barnett? The piece like that was redacted? And
yes.
She even further redacted it. There's been some new technology that's been used to uncover or reveal text on scrolls from Herculaneum that were they were so badly fused they can't unroll them without destroying the material. But there's a professor in the University of Kentucky has developed this way of almost seeing into the scrolls to be able to reveal the text. So I thought it might be interesting to use that technology to see if it could reveal the redacted text.
That's really interesting, and I should tell Sadie that, because I bet she'll do something fun with it. I should also say that what this is reminding me is I didn't go into detail about how the original texts were actually redacted. So they're not redacted through what we think of, or maybe the stereotype of like the black mark that's across the text after it's been written. They're actually preemptive. Yes, that did happen at some point, and then they're typed with a white box put over the blank space. So in other words, there are two kind of processes, right? The original file gets redacted in the 1960s or 70s by whoever is the person in charge of redacting, and then they get reprinted. Those retyped objects are what you get when you file a Freedom of Information Act file. So in other words, like it's a double blank space. So there's like not even something, which is super interesting, right? Like there isn't actually something to like try to unveil, which who knows what happened to the originals. Maybe they're somewhere ready to be looked at. But I should I'll let her know that. That's really interesting. Like how can that technology be used to like look at these kinds of preservation, or these preserved historic objects of import, how can they then be kind of reappropriated for more radical or lefty purposes? I'm into that.
But it also highlights the suspended nature of not just reduction. I mean, there is a double reduction going on.
Yeah.
But then suspended as in can't retreat.
Yeah, totally.
Or in its original form, or suspended as in, or has even like reformed into something else.
Mm-hmm.
Or has become something else, which I think is
also really intrigued by, so linking that back with the relationship between the scopic and the performative, and maybe thinking or meditating on the ways in which how we formulate the performative informs notions of optics and vice versa.
Yeah, I think the more that we talk about, or the more that I think about it, or whatever's happening in my mind right now, I'm thinking also that like the performative is scopic, like it requires a certain activation of the scopic that is also particularly interesting. Like, I mean, I know that she's been taken down already many times before by people way smarter than me, but in Butler's like originary kind of like example that she gives, right, of the kind of the romantic idea of the performative, it's all embedded in a certain kind of optic regime. So this is like, it's, to think, because, yeah, it makes me think about how the body is also an eye and the eye is also a body or something like that, which is helpful. I don't know if maybe that's where you're going, or that was a great addition.
Well, I sort of see sort of to what extent can the performative is, Kavita's earlier point is the performative pushes our understanding of the visual a little bit. To what extent can the performative teach us to see blackness, black people differently? Because I think we fetishize the visual and everything comes after that. But what if we begin with the performative track backwards?
Which is also where the object becomes interesting. If the object is what invites the performative, then it's already it's already kind of creating space for a different kind of seeing, or inviting a different relationship to the idea of seeing.
The object doesn't allow us to see.
What do we do? I know, for me too. Super helpful. Chandan, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, but Bettina.
Bettina, you have your hand up
first.
No, I
Oh, that wasn't.
No,
She didn't have a hand.
Hi, Bettina.
Hi.
It's slightly different than this conversation, but maybe it connects. And I just want to say how much I appreciate your talk and how elegant it is. And I kind of was wanting to ask you about the decisions you made to connect these specific sets of works, because I learned something by their connection that I don't think I would have known if I had just seen the works by themselves. Which was that the ways that you're thinking about a black sensibility as being a form of seeing that doesn't take participation in and doesn't desire scalable sight, and you're sort of pushing between the scalable, which is the subjectivity of both capital and labor, but also the institutional subjectivity of the museum space and arrangement in museum space of objects and so forth, and then a kind of black sensibility that you're calling that I think is all about the sense that it's already always there. Like when you think you're trying to see something, you've already seen it, and those who know what was seen, and those who don't keep on wanting to look. Do you know what I mean? So you're straining harder to see into the image of the darkened painting, but actually you already saw it. And that sense of that kind of it has already been seen, and you've seen it and never made reparation to it, or you've seen it and never narrated, seems to be something that, particularly with the desk, for example, is a kind of critique of of the sense that there's a kind of depth to be seen. It's all here, and so, and I think that really connected to this idea of the first piece where redaction suggests that there's something to be seen, but in fact, the violence of the state on Black life is all there to be seen, but that the redactedness of it is the truth, you know. And you've already seen it if you could, in terms of certain subjects. So I was just wondering how you made those choices, because they produced something I wouldn't have thought of together, and it's very moving that you were able to figure that out.
Ugh. This is such a supportive audience. I just felt energized by this project. You know how it is, you're writing something and you're in the weeds with it and you just can't see out of it, talking about that it's already there, right? That was super helpful. It was just so great. Can you just come around with me and be my PR person? So the decision was kind of a funny, you get asked in these contexts, we're having a show and these are some of the works that are here. Would you be interested in writing a catalog essay, right? And it's funny because actually a lot of the works that appear in here are no longer in the show. In fact, only 2 of the works in this, there are 2 works that will be in the show, the rest I've placed in conversation. So that's 5 of my choices and 2 of the works that were there. So it's a little bit of both, right? I had already been thinking about the relationship between many of these objects together because outside of the CAM asking me to write an essay, and it really did all start with Sadie's work. Because I was trying to think of, I became really interested in art historical genealogies and the ways that they're all fictions and lies, most of them. And they're wedded to a certain kind of chronology and biography, right? Who is in a room with who, or what training did you do, or, how do these things kind of progress in this false narrative of progression? Even in both the writing of the essay and the presentation today, I move back and forth, right? We're in the 60s, and then we're in the 2000s, and then we're back in the 60s again. That's a little bit of something that I'm playing with, right? How to write an art history or an art criticism that isn't wedded to a normative logic of genealogy. I also did become particularly interested in the uses of opacity and abstraction as these contemporary models that were out of sync with whatever was in vogue at the time, even in the 2000s, right? So, for example, the late Jack Whitton, who just passed away earlier this year, he made this piece in 1965, and at a moment when most of the works that were happening were very representational. It was civil rights photography in a pretty journalistic way, or it was abstract painting. And here he brought both together, way ahead, way before Gerhard Richter does it in the 80s, right? Before all the kind of superstars do or whatever, the thing is. So I was thinking, what would it mean to put these 2 works together that maybe aren't explicit in the sense that Sadie Barnett isn't my inspiration was Jack Whitton, right? But there is a deep conversation at the material level and at the formal level around this really healthy obsession with lacquering everything in the color black, right? To make it, to lay it bare, right? What you see is right in front of you, right? And you've already seen it and it's already been seen. And yet, what would it mean to constantly return to that side of seeing? And to maybe not look for something else, but just be fine with the repetition of that failure, right? Or that generativity, whatever you want to call it. And that's, close. If you want to read some stuff about repetition without accumulation, see Kemi about that. But so that's kind of part of the choices. So 2 of the works will appear in the show, Titus Kaphar. Oh, actually, one of the works, I just found out today the other work won't be in there. So it's just Titus Kaphar's work. So 6 of the works won't be in the show. But I'm kind of forcing their way into the conversation with the show in some way. Thanks for that comment question.
We have time for one more question before wine and cheese.
Yes. Are there any? No? Go ahead, Rachel.
That point of that art historical move that you're doing of shuttling back and forward in time, how does that, when you talked about or presented these ideas, how does it fall in an art historical audience?
I'm really lucky that my department is super rad. Like, that, you know, half of them are bad art historians, and the ones that are good don't care enough to like defend the discipline, right? Which is like super great. I will say that like there has never been a more boring conversation than when I've presented this to people very wedded to the discipline and who don't understand how this is historiography. Mm-hmm. So, and I only call it boring because, I mean, art history has always been an archaic department. It's literally made to like support the aristocracy's purchasing of their own portraits. But, so I get that, right? But there is actually some really vibrant art history happening. Huey Copeland, Krista Thompson, like Elise Archias, there are people doing work in the field that have been doing it for a really long time and fighting the discipline, right? So I just kind of ignore those questions when I get them, and I ask, and I really, you know, I think that like part of the frustration is the same frustration that many of those colleagues of mine feel when they approach one of these works and don't see that they've already seen it. Mm-hmm. Right? So I kind of am like, I don't need to bring you along, right? Which is so releasing, and that's actually a model that I learned from, I don't know, somebody like Carrie James Marshall. Like, I don't need to bring you along. You know, if you want to get on your knees and perch and look up or try to side glance it, like, sure, but if you're not willing to move your body, I can't do much for you. Right? Thank you, everybody.